In the marble corridors of Ravencrest Palace, where whispers carry more weight than gold, and loyalty can crumble with a single overheard conversation, Royal Guard Captain Marcus Thornfield discovered that some secrets are too dangerous to keep and too devastating to reveal. What he heard that cold December evening would shake the very foundations of the Aldermere royal family and force him to choose between his oath of silence and the survival of the crown itself. Captain Marcus Thornfield had served the royal house of Aldermere for 15 years, his loyalty as unwavering as the ancient stone walls of Ravencrest Palace. At 38, he had earned his position through dedication, discretion, and an almost supernatural ability to become invisible when the royal family needed privacy. His dark uniform bore the silver insignia of the Royal Guard, and his weathered hands had signed more confidentiality agreements than he cared to count. The December wind howled against the palace windows as Marcus conducted his evening rounds through the East Wing. The corridors were dimly lit by ornate chandeliers, their crystal drops catching the amber light and casting dancing shadows on portraits of long-dead monarchs. His boots made soft thuds against the Persian carpets that lined the marble floors, a sound that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. King Edmund Aldermere had ruled for 23 years, transforming the small European kingdom of Aldoria into a prosperous nation respected across the continent. His two sons, Prince Alexander and Prince Jonathan, represented the future of the monarchy. Alexander, the elder at 31, was the heir apparent, confident, charismatic, and beloved by the people. Jonathan, 28, had always lived in his brother's shadow, but possessed a sharp intellect and genuine compassion that made him quietly popular among palace staff. The relationship between the brothers had grown increasingly strained over the past 2 years. Palace gossip, which Marcus tried his best to ignore, suggested the tension stemmed from Jonathan's controversial marriage to Isabella Moreau, a French journalist who had written several articles critical of monarchical systems before her engagement. The king had initially opposed the union, but eventually gave his blessing after months of private negotiations that remained shrouded in mystery. As Marcus approached the king's private study, he noticed the heavy oak door was slightly ajar. This was unusual. His Majesty typically ensured complete privacy during his evening correspondence. The guard paused, training and instinct warring within him. Protocol demanded he ensure the king's security, but respect required he announce his presence. Before he could decide, voices drifted through the crack in the door. Marcus recognized the king's deep baritone immediately, but the other voice made him freeze. It was Prince Jonathan, and his tone carried a desperation Marcus had never heard from any member of the royal family. "Father, you cannot seriously be considering this." Jonathan's voice trembled with barely controlled emotion. "Alexander doesn't understand what Project Thaw truly represents. If you hand him those documents tomorrow, everything we've built will crumble." King Edmund's response was measured, weary. "Jonathan, you've had 2 years to prove yourself worthy of this responsibility. The incident with the Moravian ambassadors, the leaked information about the trade negotiations, your wife's activities. The council has lost faith in your judgment. Isabella had nothing to do with those leaks." Jonathan's voice rose, then dropped to an urgent whisper. "She's being framed, and you know it. Someone in Alexander's inner circle is feeding information to foreign agents, and they're using my wife as a scapegoat." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Project Thaw was a name he'd heard whispered in the highest security briefings, always followed by orders for complete information lockdown. He knew it involved Valdoria's intelligence operations and international relations, but the specifics were far above his clearance level. "Even if that were true," the king continued, "which I'm not entirely convinced of, Alexander has shown remarkable leadership during the Northern Territories crisis. The people trust him. Parliament respects him. He has the strength to handle Project Thaw's complexities." Strength. Jonathan's laugh was bitter. "Father, Alexander sees the world in absolutes. Project Thaw requires subtlety, understanding of human nature, the ability to navigate moral ambiguity. If he activates the protocols without understanding the full implications, we could find ourselves responsible for destabilizing half of Eastern Europe. There was a long pause. Marcus could hear papers rustling, the soft clink of crystal, probably the king pouring himself brandy from the decanter he kept on his desk. The decision has been made, Jonathan. Tomorrow morning, Alexander will receive the Project Thaw briefing from Director Blackwood. The transition of responsibility is non-negotiable. Then, you're condemning innocent people to death. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Marcus felt sweat beating on his forehead despite the December chill. He had stumbled into a conversation that could reshape the kingdom, and his presence here was unauthorized, potentially treasonous. That's enough. King Edmund's voice carried the authority of centuries of royal bloodline. Your emotional attachment to this project has clouded your judgment. This is precisely why the responsibility must pass to Alexander. My emotional attachment? Jonathan's voice cracked. Father, I designed half of those protocols. I spent months in Berlin, Prague, and Warsaw building the network of contacts that makes Project Thaw possible. I understand every asset, every risk, every potential consequence. Alexander has been focused on domestic policy and royal duties. He doesn't even speak Czech or Polish fluently. He'll learn. He has advisors. Advisors who will tell him what they think he wants to hear, not what he needs to know. Jonathan's frustration was palpable. Director Blackwood is brilliant, but he's never operated in the field. He doesn't understand that behind every code name in those files is a real person with a family, people who trusted us with their lives. Marcus shifted his weight, and a floorboard creaked softly. The conversation inside stopped abruptly. His heart hammered as he heard footsteps approaching the door. Without thinking, he stepped quickly into an alcove housing a marble statue of Queen Victoria Aldermere, pressing himself against the cold stone. The door opened wider, and Prince Jonathan emerged, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. His dark hair was tousled, his tie loosened, and his typically composed expression showed raw anguish. He paused in the corridor, looking left, and, right then, walked toward the main staircase with the measured steps of a man carrying an enormous burden. Marcus waited several minutes before emerging from his hiding place. The king's study door was now firmly closed, and soft classical music drifted from within. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the king's preferred piece when he needed to think through difficult decisions. As Marcus continued his rounds, his mind raced with the implications of what he'd heard. Project Thaw was clearly an intelligence operation involving Eastern European assets. Prince Jonathan had been instrumental in its development, but was being removed from oversight in favor of Prince Alexander. The younger prince believed this transition would result in loss of life, while the king saw it as necessary for the stability of the monarchy. The guard's oath required absolute loyalty to the crown, but which prince represented the crown's best interests? Alexander, the rightful heir with popular support and his father's confidence? Or Jonathan, who possessed intimate knowledge of a project that could apparently impact thousands of lives? Marcus had always prided himself on staying above palace politics, but tonight had thrust him into the center of a royal crisis that could define the future of Aldoria. As he completed his rounds and returned to the guard station, he couldn't shake the image of Prince Jonathan's desperate expression or the weight of his words. Then, you're condemning innocent people to death. The night shift passed slowly. Marcus found himself studying every shadow, analyzing every sound, wondering if other guards had overheard similar conversations or if he alone carried this burden of knowledge. The palace felt different now, less like a symbol of stability and more like a powder keg waiting for a spark. As dawn approached, and Marcus prepared to end his shift, he made a decision that would change everything. He would begin his own investigation into Project Thaw, using his access and position to uncover the truth. If Prince Jonathan was right about the consequences of the transition, then Marcus's oath to protect the royal family might require him to act against direct orders. He pulled out a small notebook he kept for security observations and wrote his first entry. December 15th. Overheard conversation between King Edmund and Prince Jonathan regarding Project Thaw. Further investigation required to assess security implications. It was a simple entry that would lead to extraordinary consequences, setting in motion events that would test the limits of loyalty, expose decades-old secrets, and ultimately determine whether the royal house of Aldermere would survive the storm that was coming. The morning sun cast long shadows through the palace windows as Marcus Thornfield walked home, carrying secrets that would soon make him the most dangerous man in Valdoria Point 3 days after overhearing the conversation in the king's study. Marcus Thornfield found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about palace life. The morning briefing had been routine, schedule updates, security protocols, visitor clearances, but beneath the surface, tensions were escalating in ways that only someone with his access could detect. Prince Alexander had indeed received the Project Thaw briefing, just as the king had promised. Marcus had watched director Helena Blackwood arrive at dawn with a leather briefcase handcuffed to her wrist, accompanied by 2 intelligence officers he didn't recognize. They had spent 4 hours in the secure conference room on the 3rd floor, and when Alexander emerged, his usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something harder, more calculating. Marcus had positioned himself strategically throughout the palace over the past 3 days, using his legitimate duties to observe and gather information. What he discovered troubled him deeply. The cheerful facade of royal life continued. Public appearances, charity events, state dinners. But underneath, a complex web of alliances and betrayals was taking shape. His investigation began with the palace's computer systems. As head of security, Marcus had administrative access to communication logs, though not the content of encrypted messages. What he found was a pattern of unusual activity. In the weeks leading up to the Project Thaw transition, there had been a significant increase in encrypted communications between certain palace staff and external contacts in Berlin, Prague, and Warsaw, the same cities Prince Jonathan had mentioned. More concerning was the timing. Many of these communications had occurred during periods when Prince Jonathan was away from the palace, suggesting someone was coordinating activities in his absence. The metadata showed messages being sent from terminals assigned to Alexander's personal staff, but also from locations throughout the palace, making it difficult to identify specific individuals. Marcus's breakthrough came when he decided to review security footage from the past month. The palace's surveillance system was extensive but discreet, designed to monitor for external threats rather than internal activities. However, certain areas were covered for security purposes, including corridors leading to sensitive areas. Late one evening, while reviewing footage from the diplomatic wing, Marcus spotted something that made him pause the playback. Lady Catherine Pemberton, Prince Alexander's private secretary and longtime confidant, was shown entering the secure communications room at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks earlier. According to the duty logs, no legitimate palace business required access to that facility at such an hour. More footage revealed a pattern. Lady Catherine had been accessing the communications room during off hours at least twice a week for the past 2 months. Each visit lasted approximately 30 to 45 minutes, enough time to transmit significant amounts of information. But the revelation that truly shook Marcus came when he cross-referenced these visits with Prince Jonathan's travel schedule. Every single unauthorized communication session had occurred when Jonathan was away from the palace, often during his trips to Eastern European capitals for what were described as cultural exchange programs. Lady Catherine Pemberton was 53 years old, a career palace employee who had served the royal family for over 25 years. She had started as a junior secretary and worked her way up through dedication and discretion. Her personnel file was impeccable, her background checks always clean, her loyalty supposedly unquestionable. Marcus realized he needed more information about Project Thaw itself. Using his security clearance, he accessed what limited documentation was available to him. What he found painted a picture of an operation far more complex and dangerous than he had imagined. Project Thaw had been developed over a 5-year period as a response to increasing Russian influence in Eastern Europe. The operation involved a network of intelligence assets, political contacts, and business leaders across multiple countries, all coordinated through Valdoria's intelligence service. The goal was to provide real-time intelligence about Russian activities while supporting democratic movements in vulnerable nations. The assets involved were not professional spies, but ordinary citizens who had been recruited through various means, some patriotic, some financial, some through more questionable methods. Many were unaware of the full scope of their involvement, believing they were simply providing information to help their countries maintain independence. Prince Jonathan's role had been crucial. His official visits to Eastern Europe had provided cover for establishing and maintaining contact with these assets. His linguistic abilities, cultural knowledge, and genuine empathy had made him highly effective at building trust with people who were risking their lives by cooperating with Valdoria. The files Marcus could access contained coded references to dozens of individuals, but their real identities were classified above his level. However, he could see that the network had been remarkably successful. Information from Project Thaw assets had reportedly prevented 3 attempted coups, exposed corruption schemes involving hundreds of millions of dollars, and provided early warning of military movements that could have destabilized the entire region. But success had brought attention. Marcus found intelligence reports suggesting that Russian services had become aware of Project Thaw and were actively working to identify and eliminate the asset network. Several contacts had gone silent in recent months, and there were indications that at least 3 assets had been compromised, though their fates were unknown. This context made Prince Jonathan's desperate words to the king take on new meaning. If Alexander took control of Project Thaw without understanding its nuances, decisions made in ignorance could expose the entire network. And if the assets were indeed being systematically compromised, as Jonathan suspected, then someone with access to the operation's details was feeding information to hostile forces. Marcus's investigation into Lady Catherine's activities took a dramatic turn when he decided to conduct physical surveillance. Using his knowledge of the palace's layout and daily routines, he positioned himself to observe her movements during her next scheduled unauthorized communication session. On a Thursday night, Marcus waited in a maintenance corridor adjacent to the communications room. At 11:23 p.m., Lady Catherine arrived, using her access card to enter the secure facility. Through a ventilation grate, Marcus could hear fragments of her conversation, though the identity of the person on the other end remained unclear. The transition is proceeding as planned. Lady Catherine spoke in fluent German, a skill not mentioned in her personnel file. Alexander has full access now. Jonathan has been completely isolated from the project. There was a pause as she listened to the response. Yes, the prod contacts are particularly vulnerable. Without Jonathan's personal relationships, they'll be operating blind. We should be able to roll up that entire cell within 2 weeks. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. Lady Catherine was discussing Project Thaw assets as if they were pieces on a chessboard to be sacrificed for some larger strategic purpose. The "we" in her statement suggested she was working with others, likely foreign agents. The Warsaw operation is more complex, she continued. Jonathan built stronger safeguards there. But Alexander's approach will be more aggressive, less patient. The assets will be forced into more exposed positions, making them easier targets. Marcus realized he was listening to a conversation about the systematic betrayal of people who had risked everything to help Valdoria and its allies. Lady Catherine wasn't just a security breach. She was an active enemy agent who had infiltrated the highest levels of the royal household. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering operational details that Marcus couldn't fully understand, but which clearly involved the identification and elimination of Project Thaw assets. When Lady Catherine finally ended her call and prepared to leave, Marcus faced the most difficult decision of his career. He could arrest her immediately, but that would alert her handlers that their operation had been discovered. They might accelerate their plans to eliminate assets or simply disappear and resurface elsewhere. Alternatively, he could attempt to gather more intelligence about the scope of the conspiracy, but every day he waited increased the risk to innocent people. Marcus chose a middle path. He would continue surveillance while quietly alerting Prince Jonathan to what he had discovered. Jonathan's knowledge of Project Thaw could help identify which assets were most at risk, and his connections might provide ways to warn them without exposing the ongoing investigation. But first, Marcus needed to understand the full scope of Lady Catherine's betrayal. Over the following days, he expanded his investigation, looking for other potential accomplices within the palace. What he discovered was even more troubling than he had imagined. The conspiracy involved at least 4 other palace employees, including a junior intelligence officer, a communications technician, and 2 members of the domestic staff who had access to private areas where sensitive conversations might be overheard. They had been operating for months, possibly years, building a comprehensive picture of Valdoria's intelligence capabilities. More significantly, Marcus found evidence that Prince Alexander himself might be unwittingly facilitating the conspiracy. His more aggressive approach to intelligence operations, combined with his lack of experience in the subtle world of human intelligence, was making it easier for Lady Catherine and her associates to manipulate information flow and operational decisions. Alexander's first major decision regarding Project Thaw had been to restructure the entire operation, consolidating control under Director Blackwood and reducing the autonomy of field operatives. In intelligence terms, this created centralization that could be more easily monitored and manipulated by hostile forces. The prince had also approved new communication protocols that, while more secure in theory, actually created additional opportunities for interception by someone with Lady Catherine's level of access. Every message now passed through systems she could monitor, giving her unprecedented visibility into operational planning. As Marcus compiled his evidence, he realized that the conspiracy went beyond simple espionage. The goal appeared to be the complete destruction of Project Thaw and the elimination of everyone involved in it. Success would not only remove a significant obstacle to Russian expansion in Eastern Europe, but would also create a massive intelligence failure that could undermine confidence in the Valdorian monarchy. The personal dimension was equally troubling. Prince Jonathan's reputation would be destroyed if Project Thaw collapsed under his successor's leadership. His warnings about the transition's risks would be dismissed as sour grapes, and his career in public service would be over. Isabella Moreau, his wife, would likely be blamed for security breaches she had nothing to do with, completing her transformation from respected journalist to royal pariah. Marcus realized he was looking at a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to neutralize 2 potential threats to foreign interests, an effective intelligence operation and a prince who understood how to run it successfully. The timing was perfect. King Edmund's natural desire to prepare his heir for greater responsibilities had been manipulated to serve enemy objectives. The weight of this knowledge was crushing. Marcus had sworn an oath to protect the royal family. But which royals needed protection? Alexander from manipulation he didn't recognize? Jonathan from a conspiracy designed to destroy him? The king from the consequences of decisions made with incomplete information? As he prepared for what he knew would be the most dangerous conversation of his life, Marcus Thornfield understood that his next actions would determine not only his own fate, but the survival of dozens of innocent people whose only crime had been trusting the royal house of Aldermere to protect them. Marcus Thornfield had not slept properly in 4 days. The evidence he had gathered painted a picture of betrayal so comprehensive that it threatened not only Project Thaw, but the entire foundation of trust upon which the Valdorian Intelligence Service operated. Now, standing in the shadow of St. Margaret's Chapel on the palace grounds at dawn, he waited for Prince Jonathan to arrive for what would be the most treasonous conversation of his career. The meeting had been arranged through careful maneuvering. Marcus had used his knowledge of Jonathan's habits. The prince always took an early morning walk through the chapel grounds when he was troubled, to position himself where a seemingly chance encounter could occur. The location was perfect, far enough from main palace to avoid electronic surveillance, but close enough to appear coincidental. Prince Jonathan emerged from the morning mist at precisely 6:15 a.m., his breath visible in the December cold. He wore a heavy wool coat over casual clothes, and His usually impeccable appearance showed signs of a strain he had been under since losing control of Project Thaw. When he saw Marcus standing near the chapel entrance, he paused, clearly surprised to encounter palace security in this location. "Captain Thornfield," Jonathan said formally. "Rather early for chapel visits, isn't it?" Marcus had rehearsed this moment, but, facing the prince in person, he found himself struggling with the enormity of what he was about to reveal. "Your Highness, I need to speak with you about a security matter of the utmost urgency. What I'm about to tell you constitutes a violation of my oath of silence, but I believe it's necessary to prevent a catastrophe." Jonathan's expression shifted from polite curiosity to intense focus. He glanced around the grounds, confirming they were alone, then nodded for Marcus to continue. "4 nights ago, I overheard your conversation with His Majesty about Project Thaw," Marcus began. "Since then, I have conducted an unauthorized investigation that has revealed evidence of a conspiracy within the palace to destroy the operation and eliminate its assets." For a moment, Jonathan said nothing, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Then, Captain, what you're describing could constitute treason on multiple levels. Your unauthorized surveillance, your investigation, and now this conversation. Are you certain you want to proceed?" "Your Highness, Lady Catherine Pemberton has been conducting unauthorized communications with foreign agents for at least 2 months. She has been providing intelligence about Project Thaw that will allow hostile forces to systematically eliminate your assets. The conspiracy involves at least 4 other palace employees and has been coordinated to take advantage of your removal from the project." Jonathan's composure cracked slightly. "Catherine? She's been with my brother for 12 years. She helped raise him after our mother died. Are you absolutely certain about this accusation?" Marcus reached into his coat and withdrew a folder containing photographs, communication logs, and surveillance reports. "The evidence is comprehensive, Your Highness. Lady Catherine has been accessing secure communication systems during unauthorized hours, always when you were away from the palace. She speaks fluent German and Russian, languages not mentioned in her personnel file. I have recordings of her discussing the elimination of Prague and Warsaw contacts." As Jonathan reviewed the evidence, his face grew increasingly pale. "My God," he whispered. "The timing, every time I returned from Prague or Warsaw with new intelligence, there would be a security review. Catherine always insisted on seeing the raw reports to help Alexander understand the context. She said it would help him prepare for eventual leadership of the project. The security reviews were covers for intelligence transmission," Marcus confirmed. "Your reports were being passed to hostile services, allowing them to identify and target your assets. The increase in compromised contacts over the past months wasn't coincidental. It was systematic elimination." Jonathan sat heavily on a stone bench, the weight of betrayal clearly affecting him. "How many people are we talking about, Captain? How many lives are at risk?" Based on the communication patterns and operational references I could access, at least 30 active assets across 5 countries. But the full scope may be much larger. Your removal from Project Thaw has accelerated the timeline. They're moving to eliminate the entire network while Alexander is still learning the operation. "Alexander has no idea," Jonathan said quietly. "He trusts Catherine completely. She's been feeding him assessments that emphasize aggressive action, rapid expansion of operations, centralized control, all strategies that would expose assets to greater risk and make them easier to identify." Marcus nodded gravely. "The restructuring your brother approved has created vulnerabilities that Lady Catherine can exploit. Every operational decision now passes through systems she can monitor. Every communication can be intercepted. Every asset location can be determined." Prince Jonathan stood and began pacing, his analytical mind clearly working through the implications. "Captain, what you're describing isn't just espionage. It's a sophisticated operation designed to destroy Valdoria's intelligence capabilities while discrediting the monarchy itself. When Project Thaw collapses and dozens of people die, the blame will fall on Alexander for mismanaging the transition, on me for creating an inherently flawed operation, and on the royal family for incompetent leadership. That appears to be the objective, Your Highness. The question is what we can do to prevent it. Jonathan turned to face Marcus directly. We have several problems. First, we can't expose Lady Catherine without alerting her handlers that we've discovered the conspiracy. They could accelerate their timeline or simply disappear and resurface elsewhere. Second, we can't warn the assets directly without using communication channels that Lady Catherine monitors. Third, we can't approach Alexander directly because his trust in Catherine is so complete that he might dismiss our evidence or inadvertently alert her to our investigation. What about His Majesty? Marcus suggested. My father. Jonathan paused, choosing his words carefully. My father made his decision about Project Thaw based on his assessment of my reliability and Alexander's capabilities. If I approach him now with accusations against someone he has trusted for over a decade, accusations that conveniently support my position that the transition was premature, how do you think he'll react? Marcus understood. King Edmund would likely interpret Jonathan's accusations as a desperate attempt to regain control of the project, particularly given the family tensions surrounding Jonathan's marriage and his recent conflicts with palace leadership. Then, what do you propose, Your Highness? Jonathan was quiet for several minutes, staring at the chapel's ancient stones as if they might hold answers. When he spoke, his voice carried a resolve that Marcus hadn't heard since the prince's involvement with Project Thaw began. We need to turn the conspiracy against itself, Jonathan said. Lady Catherine and her associates are planning to eliminate the asset network systematically. But they're also creating evidence of their own activities every time they communicate with their handlers. If we can document those communications and trace them to their sources, we can expose the entire operation. That would require us to allow the conspiracy to continue operating while we gather evidence, Marcus pointed out. More assets could be compromised in the meantime. Some assets, yes. But if we act too quickly and only catch the palace conspirators without identifying their handlers, the foreign operation will simply adapt and continue elsewhere. We need to map the entire network before we strike. Jonathan began outlining a complex counterintelligence plan that would require precise timing and considerable personal risk for both men. Marcus would continue his surveillance while expanding it to cover all suspected conspirators. Meanwhile, Jonathan would begin his own investigation from outside the palace, using his personal contacts in intelligence services across Europe to gather information about recent asset compromises and foreign infiltration attempts. I'll need to be extremely careful, Jonathan explained. Any unusual activity on my part could alert Catherine that I'm investigating. I'll use the cover of supporting Isabella's journalism work. She has contacts in intelligence communities who might provide insights without realizing the full significance of what they're sharing. Marcus felt a moment of doubt. Your Highness, this plan requires us to essentially run an unauthorized counterintelligence operation against our own palace. If we're discovered before we have sufficient evidence, the consequences will be severe. Captain, if we don't act, 30 or more innocent people will die, and Valdoria will lose its ability to monitor and counter Russian expansion in Eastern Europe. The strategic implications could destabilize the entire region. Personal consequences pale in comparison to those stakes. The two men spent another hour refining their approach, establishing communication protocols, and fallback plans. They would meet every 3 days at different locations to share intelligence and coordinate their activities. Marcus would focus on technical surveillance and document gathering, while Jonathan would work his human intelligence contacts to build a comprehensive picture of the foreign operation. As they prepared to separate, Jonathan placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Captain, what you're doing requires extraordinary courage. You're risking your career, your freedom, and possibly your life to protect people you've never met. I want you to know that whatever happens, your service to the crown, the real crown, not the political maneuvering, will not be forgotten. Marcus straightened, feeling the weight of his uniform and his oath. Your Highness, I swore to protect the royal family and the kingdom. Sometimes that requires protecting them from themselves or from those who would use them for destructive purposes. Lady Catherine and her associates aren't just betraying intelligence assets. They're manipulating Prince Alexander and undermining the monarchy itself. Over the following week, their unauthorized investigation expanded rapidly. Marcus's technical surveillance revealed that the conspiracy was even more extensive than initially suspected. Communication intercepts showed coordination with intelligence services from at least 3 different countries, suggesting a multinational effort to eliminate Project Thaw. Meanwhile, Jonathan's discreet inquiries through Isabella's journalistic contacts produced disturbing confirmations. Intelligence professionals in Berlin, Prague, and Warsaw had all noted increased Russian activity targeting individuals who matched the profiles of Project Thaw assets. Several contacts had reported being approached by unknown individuals asking questions that suggested intimate knowledge of their cooperation with Valdorian intelligence. Most alarming was intelligence from a source in the German Federal Intelligence Service who reported that Russian operatives had been observed conducting surveillance of locations associated with Project Thaw operations. The source couldn't provide specific details without violating classification protocols, but the implication was clear. The asset network was being systematically mapped for elimination. Jonathan realized they were running out of time. Lady Catherine's next communication session could provide the final intelligence needed for a coordinated strike against all remaining assets. The prince made a difficult decision. They needed to expand their circle of trust to include someone with operational authority who could take immediate protective action. But first, they needed irrefutable evidence that would convince even the most skeptical observer that Lady Catherine Pemberton, trusted confidant of Prince Alexander and veteran palace employee, was actually a sophisticated enemy agent whose betrayal threatened not only dozens of lives, but the security of the entire kingdom. The trap they were about to set would require perfect execution, split-second timing, and a willingness to risk everything on a single moment of revelation that would either save Project Thaw or destroy everyone involved in trying to protect it. The trap was set for December 28th, 3 days after Christmas. The palace remained decorated with evergreen garlands and golden lights, creating an atmosphere of celebration that sharply contrasted with the deadly serious operation about to unfold in its corridors. Marcus Thornfield stood at his post near the communications room, his heart beating so hard he was certain it could be heard throughout the marble hallway. The plan Jonathan had devised was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. They would provide Lady Catherine with irresistible bait, false intelligence about a new Project Thaw operation that would require immediate transmission to her handlers. If she took the bait and attempted to pass the information, they would have her in the act of treason, with evidence sufficient to convince even King Edmund of her betrayal. The bait was a fabricated report suggesting that Prince Jonathan had secretly maintained contact with 3 high-value assets in Moscow, individuals positioned within the Russian intelligence apparatus itself who were providing information about operations targeting Valdorian interests. The report, carefully crafted to appear genuine, indicated that these assets were planning to defect to Valdoria within the next week, bringing with them intelligence that could expose Russian infiltration operations across Europe. To make the trap work, the false report had to reach Lady Catherine through channels that would appear natural and uncontrolled. Jonathan had accomplished this by leaving the document in his private study, knowing that Alexander would request a briefing on any intelligence materials found among his brother's possessions. Alexander's desire to demonstrate thorough control of Project Thaw would ensure that Lady Catherine was asked to review and analyze any such documents. Marcus checked his watch, 11:35 p.m. If Lady Catherine followed her established pattern, she would access the communications room within the next 15 minutes. Hidden throughout the palace, Jonathan waited with Director Helena Blackwood and 2 trusted intelligence officers who had been briefed on the operation that morning. The director had been skeptical until presented with the comprehensive evidence Marcus and Jonathan had gathered over the past week. At 11:42 p.m., Lady Catherine appeared at the end of the corridor, walking with the confident stride of someone who believed her activities remained undetected. She wore dark clothing and soft-soled shoes, practical attire for someone conducting clandestine activities. Marcus watched through the gap in a partially open service door as she approached the communications room. Lady Catherine's access card clicked in the electronic lock, and she disappeared inside the secure facility. Marcus immediately activated a small recording device and pressed himself closer to the ventilation grate that had served as his listening post during previous surveillance sessions. The conversation began in German, as expected. Lady Catherine's voice carried excitement that was chilling considering the subject matter. Priority transmission, she began. Intelligence gold mine acquired. Jonathan maintained direct contact with 3 assets inside Moscow Center. Codenames Raven, Nightingale, and Sparrow, all positioned within Directorate S operations. Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction. Lady Catherine had taken the bait completely, apparently never questioning how Prince Jonathan could have maintained contact with Moscow-based assets while under palace scrutiny. Assets are preparing defection within 7 days, Lady Catherine continued. Extraction planned through Helsinki route. Intelligence payload includes comprehensive data on sleeper operations across Western Europe, identification of all Valdorian assets, and operational plans for systematic elimination of remaining Project Thaw network. There was a pause as she listened to her handler's response. When she spoke again, her voice carried urgency. Recommend immediate activation of Moscow termination protocols. If these 3 defect with their intelligence, our entire European operation will be exposed. Suggest coordination with Berlin and Prague stations for simultaneous action. Marcus realized that Lady Catherine's response to the false intelligence was revealing the scope of the conspiracy far beyond what they had originally suspected. References to Moscow termination protocols and coordination with other stations suggested an international network of considerable sophistication. Confirmed, Lady Catherine continued. Alexander has authorized aggressive expansion of Project Thaw operations beginning January 15th. New centralized communication protocols will provide complete visibility into all asset activities. Recommend postponing broader network elimination until after new protocols are implemented. Will allow for more comprehensive intelligence gathering before final action. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, during which Lady Catherine transmitted detailed information about palace security procedures, Prince Alexander's daily routines, and assessment of various royal family members' psychological profiles and potential vulnerabilities. She concluded with a request for updated instructions regarding Isabella Moreau, Prince Jonathan's wife, suggesting that neutralizing her influence might require more direct action than the character assassination campaign that had been employed thus far. When Lady Catherine finally ended her transmission and prepared to leave the communications room, Marcus knew they had gathered evidence sufficient to expose not only her betrayal but the existence of a multinational conspiracy designed to destroy Valdorian intelligence capabilities and destabilize the monarchy itself. The arrest happened swiftly and quietly. As Lady Catherine emerged from the communications room, she found herself facing Director Blackwood, 2 intelligence officers, and Prince Jonathan, who stepped out of the shadows like a figure from a nightmare. Lady Catherine Elizabeth Pemberton, Director Blackwood, said formally, "By the authority of His Majesty's Intelligence Service, you are under arrest for treason, espionage, and conspiracy against the Crown." The woman who had served the royal family for 25 years showed no surprise, no protest, no attempt at denial. Instead, she smiled with the cold satisfaction of someone whose work was already complete. "Your Highness," she said to Jonathan with mock courtesy, "how delightfully dramatic. Though I suspect you won a battle while losing the war. The intelligence I just transmitted will result in the elimination of your precious Moscow assets within hours. 3 people who trusted Valdoria with their lives will be dead before sunrise, and their deaths will be on your conscience." Jonathan's face remained impassive. "Lady Catherine, the Moscow assets don't exist. The intelligence you transmitted was false, created specifically to expose your treasonous activities." For the first time, Lady Catherine's composure cracked. Impossible. The documentation was authentic, classified at the highest levels, signed by your personal seal. "Forged," Jonathan said simply. though I must compliment your handlers on their thoroughness. Your transmission will indeed result in action by Russian intelligence services. Wasted effort searching for assets who never existed while providing us with invaluable information about their operational capabilities and priorities. The full scope of what Jonathan and Marcus had accomplished became clear as Director Blackwood explained the counterintelligence implications. Lady Catherine's transmission had not only exposed her own treasonous activities, but had provided detailed intelligence about Russian operations across Europe. Her handler's responses had revealed communication protocols, operational hierarchies, and strategic priorities that Western intelligence services had been trying to penetrate for years. Moreover, the false intelligence about aggressive expansion of Project Thaw had been designed to provoke premature action by hostile forces, potentially exposing additional conspirators and foreign operatives who would move to counter operations that existed only on paper. The arrests continued throughout the night. The junior intelligence officer, communications technician, and domestic staff members who had been part of Lady Catherine's network were taken into custody with evidence gathered through Marcus's expanded surveillance. Each arrest provided additional intelligence that led to further revelations about the scope of foreign infiltration into Valdorian institutions. By dawn, the immediate threat to Project Thaw assets had been neutralized, but the broader implications were still being assessed. King Edmund, awakened at 3 a.m. to be briefed on the night's events, struggled to comprehend how someone he had trusted for decades could have betrayed not only the crown, but the innocent people who had risked their lives supporting Valdorian interests. Prince Alexander's reaction was perhaps the most difficult to witness. The realization that his most trusted advisor had been manipulating his decisions to serve enemy interests shattered his confidence in his own judgment. Every decision he had made regarding Project Thaw, every strategic assessment he had accepted, every operational change he had approved, all had been influenced by someone working to ensure his failure. How could I not have seen it? Alexander asked his brother during a private meeting in the king's study, the same room where Marcus had first overheard the conversation that started everything. Catherine guided my every decision about Project Thaw. She convinced me that centralization would improve security, that aggressive expansion would demonstrate strength, that your approach was too cautious and emotional. Jonathan's response revealed the maturity and wisdom that had made him so effective in intelligence work. Alexander, Lady Catherine, was a professional intelligence operative who had been preparing for this operation for years. She knew exactly what to say and how to say it to appeal to your leadership style and personal psychology. The failure isn't yours. It belongs to the system that allowed someone to infiltrate our institutions so completely. The conversation between the brothers continued for hours, during which they began the difficult process of rebuilding Project Thaw with proper security protocols while maintaining the trust relationships that made the operation effective. Alexander formally returned operational control to Jonathan, acknowledging that his brother's expertise and established contacts were irreplaceable. King Edmund faced his own reckonings. The decision to remove Jonathan from Project Thaw had been based on assessments provided by compromised sources and interpreted through the filter of family tensions that had been deliberately exacerbated by enemy influence. His judgment, usually so sound, had been manipulated in ways that could have resulted in catastrophic consequences. Marcus Thornfield found himself in an unprecedented position. His unauthorized investigation and violation of direct orders had prevented a disaster, but had also demonstrated serious vulnerabilities in palace security protocols. Rather than face disciplinary action, he was promoted to Director of Palace Security, with expanded authority to investigate and counter internal threats. The personal cost of the conspiracy's exposure was significant. Isabella Moreau, Prince Jonathan's wife, had been subjected to months of character assassination designed to isolate her husband from sources of support and intelligence. Though her reputation was cleared by the revelation of Lady Catherine's activities, the damage to her relationship with the royal family and the broader public would take time to heal. Project Thaw itself required complete restructuring. Every asset had to be contacted and briefed on the security breach. New communication protocols had to be established, and operational procedures had to be redesigned to prevent future infiltration. Several assets chose to end their cooperation, understandably shaken by how close they had come to exposure and elimination. But the operation survived and in many ways emerged stronger than before. The false intelligence trap had not only neutralized immediate threats, but had provided valuable insights into enemy capabilities and intentions. The intelligence gathered from Lady Catherine's network led to the exposure of similar operations in other European countries, dealing a significant blow to Russian intelligence activities across the continent. 3 months later, Marcus stood once again in the corridors of Ravencrest Palace, but his perspective had fundamentally changed. The marble halls and crystal chandeliers remained as magnificent as ever, but he now understood that their beauty concealed constant struggles between competing interests, hidden agendas, and forces that sought to use the monarchy's power for destructive purposes. The royal house of Aldermere had survived its greatest internal crisis in decades, but only because one guard had chosen loyalty to principles over blind obedience to orders, and one prince had been willing to risk everything to protect people who had trusted him with their lives. The final irony was not lost on Marcus. Lady Catherine's betrayal had been designed to destroy Project Thaw and discredit the royal family's ability to conduct intelligence operations. Instead, her exposure had strengthened both the operation and the monarchy, demonstrating that institutions built on genuine principles could adapt and overcome even the most sophisticated attempts at subversion. As he completed his evening rounds through the palace, Marcus reflected on a lesson that would guide his service for years to come. Sometimes protecting the crown required protecting it from itself, and true loyalty meant having the courage to act when action was necessary, regardless of personal cost. The secrets he had discovered and the actions he had taken would remain classified indefinitely, known only to a small circle of individuals who understood their significance. But in the hidden world of intelligence operations and royal intrigue, the story of the royal guard who overheard a conversation and chose to act would become legend, proof that sometimes one person's courage and integrity could change the course of history itself.